You've probably seen some videos on the PS5 versus Xbox Series X comparison, or 1 month after launch, you're wondering if it's worth your time to go out of your way to try to acquire one through a retailer and go through a cycle of page refreshes, Twitter stock notifications, fast and sneaky quick trigger fingers, or probably some swift disappointment. All of which are fair considerations. This isn't just like choosing between FIFA and Pro Evolution Soccer. It's some serious cash to drop on a next generation console, and you want to make sure that you make the best choice. I put air quotes around best because honestly it is a little bit subjective, but let's see if Team PlayStation deserves your hard-earned money. Before I dive into it, know that this isn't going to be a comparison of the PS5 against PC gaming or the Xbox Series X for that matter. All have their merits and downsides, and I'll do my best to try to elaborate why I went with the PlayStation 5 and what the experience has been like with that perspective. Across all platforms, I gravitate towards high quality games. And by high quality games, to me, that means tight gameplay mechanics, meaning is it fun to play, immersive storytelling, or replayability. These can be independent or combined. You can get one of these three pretty much across the board, but getting any combination of these gets much harder, in particular immersive or good storytelling. And the truth is, to that storytelling point at least, some of the best AAA games come from PlayStation Studios. PlayStation has a track record proven over the last generation and a half. Since around midway through the PS3's life cycle, PlayStation, to me, owns the best exclusives on consoles. To distill it down as simple as possible, it's about the games. That's it, that's my single most important factor. The PS5 has grand promises of a future with continuing down the path of buying and purchasing individual titles. To very good success, they can sell you a console based on being able to play God of War, Uncharted, The Last of Us, Ratchet & Clank, Horizon, Spider-Man, and so on. It's actually not that much different from Nintendo's strategy, and they have clearly less powerful software, but it still works. However, most of these titles that I just mentioned aren't really getting the release until well into this system's lifecycle. So what is the experience like today? As a person that also has a relatively higher end PC, the PS5 is the closest the console has ever felt to a PC gaming experience. High resolutions at 4K or slightly lower resolution but high frame rates for buttery smooth gameplay, that's what you feel the most, even compared to the PS4 Pro for example. And from what I gather by Xbox Series X reviews, it's a pretty similar experience over there. Now, the graphical fidelity doesn't feel as intense as going from PS3 to PS4 did. But really, unless you're doing some pretty hardcore side-by-side comparisons, you won't really notice it all that much from a strictly resolution standpoint. What you will notice in games like Spider-Man or even Assassin's Creed Valhalla is the refresh rate or the increase in the assets in the gameplay world, making it feel more alive, vibrant, and lived in. It definitely adds to the level of immersiveness, and there's plenty of eye candy when you want to just stop and take in your surroundings. However, on the hardware side, 4K at 120Hz or 8K aren't even available at the time of launch. Not even VRR, which will be variable refresh rates, something to prevent screen tearing, which PC gamers are all too familiar with, is enabled, assuming you even have a TV that supports HDMI 2.1. Yeah, that's right. To take full advantage of the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, you're going to need to upgrade your television at some point if you aren't already running on a 4K TV that's capable of 120 refresh rate, variable refresh rate, and HDR. So it's just something to keep in mind. Yet the most disappointing thing to me on the hardware side right now is the disabled expansion slot for an NVMe SSD. That means that the likelihood of you running out of space on the 667 gigabytes of usable storage on the hard drive is pretty high after you get 5 or 6 games deep. Now you can install and store PlayStation 4 titles, which by the way, the vast majority of PS4 titles are backwards compatible on the PS5, but you can't store any PS5 games on an external drive in any capacity. The explanation there is a little more reasonable, as games developed for the PlayStation 5 are accommodating the higher speed and new technologies in the SSD. So trying to run those games off of an old hard drive via USB really wouldn't work, and it would break that experience, I guess. But again, just another consideration that you have to keep in mind. Obviously, the tune here can change if you're watching this in the future and that expansion slot is now available along with the rest of the unavailable at launch features of the PS5. Also, yeah, the PS5 is a pretty big console, but it's not so much the size that can be potentially tricky, but rather its unorthodox shape. Make sure there's enough space in your media center or desk. You're likely going to have to move some things around so it just doesn't stick out like a sore thumb, although it's probably going to do that anyways. Now, the controller. The much talked and hyped about DualSense controller. Physically, it's larger than the DualShock 4, which was already a bit of a redesign of the DualShock 3, but it's not OG Xbox ridiculous in size. I think most people will be happy with this change, particularly if you have larger hands, and it's not really a problem for people with smaller hands either, although it does kind of push that limit. This DualSense controller, however, really has taken things to the next level, and it's completely true that it's actually the most next-gen feeling feature or aspect of the PlayStation 5 right now. That's not necessarily a bad thing for the rest of the system, it's just that this controller is that freaking cool. The haptic feedback is very nice, but the real star here are the adaptive triggers. Changing the resistance depending on the gameplay happening on screen isn't something you exactly think about, but once you feel it, it's actually an incredible feature, as it's literal physical feedback to your gameplay that isn't just, we're gonna shake some motors that you feel in your hands. My first whoa moment with the adaptive triggers was during Bugsnax when taking a photo. You get a very naturally feeling resistance that basically emulates pressing an old school film camera trigger. Another example of it being used in gameplay is Black Ops Cold War, as each gun has its own adaptive trigger feedback, which I do think people will start taking into account when you're building out your loadouts. But the biggest showcase of the DualSense controller will be had with the included and free downloadable Astro's Playroom. You get the full range of the controller's adaptive triggers, haptic feedback, and touchpad. It does take it a bit to the extreme in some parts, so we'll actually have to keep an eye on any hand fatigue or even potential carpal tunnel if developers incorporate these features too heavily. But luckily, this can be easily resolved by adjusting the haptic and trigger sensitivity in the console's controller settings. Still, it's a recommended first play while you wait for your other games to install or download when you first set up your console, and it's surprisingly good and has diverse gameplay for a freebie. As far as the UI that they took forever to reveal, it's certainly an improvement on the PS4 UI, retaining the familiarity of the flow but bringing some much needed improvements. Speaking of, I don't know why it takes a full console refresh to overhaul the UI. This is just an aside, but a lot of these things can be improved on and implemented pretty easily. Regardless, my personal favorite improvement of that UI is the vastly improved PlayStation Store experience. Obviously, thanks to the updated technology, everything is zippy and quick, but anyone coming from PS4 will feel a night and day difference thanks to the store being basically embedded into the UI instead of having to launch a separate store or app. Now, I personally don't use the media functions of my consoles that much, but it's a similar experience. You can install a media app like YouTube, Netflix, Apple TV+, and you launch them to watch your content. I like that it's separated from your game content, but that leads to the next point, because that's as far as any form of organizing goes on your system. No dynamic or customizable themes, and the weirdest one, no folders feature that the PS4 has at the time of this recording. It feels like a backwards thing to do, like it's an oversight. And this is an area of the system where I do think the Xbox flat out provides a better experience. As a final note on media and software, do keep in mind that if you plan on using an external capture card with a PC to stream or record your gameplay, HDCP needs to be disabled, and your media apps will only work with that feature on. It basically means that there's going to be a bit of annoying settings modifications and switching back and forth each time you want to stream gameplay or watch your content. And one more thing, for some reason the network technology, wired or Wi-Fi, on the PS4 was abysmal. I hated it. I pay for a 1 gigabit connection here at home and I would never get anywhere near those speeds when I was downloading games. All of that has finally been resolved with the PlayStation 5. It's a little bit of an odd thing to point out because I don't think it should have been that bad in the first place, so it's kind of weird to praise them for it. But at least we finally have an experience on the network side that feels like we're in 2020. And so, we approach the single most important aspect of any console review: the games. Now, I specifically am not going to touch much on the social aspects or the hardware specifications such as the teraflops, and game selection is the one thing that is, or at the very least it should be, on everyone's list, next to budget and then followed by whatever your friends and family are playing on. It's not that I don't think that those aspects aren't important, I just don't believe that there's enough of a discernible difference for it to be a major consideration. Still, it is a very powerful gaming machine for the price. Listen, I love gaming on my PC, but there's just no way that you can build a comparable gaming experience with brand new parts, because we're talking about a brand new console, at this price range of $500. And certainly not when you take into consideration that the digital version is even $100 cheaper. Now, with all that, there have been 5 titles I've been playing specific to the PS5, not including PS4 backwards compatible titles, so no Cyberpunk in this review. And technically, there are only 2 games that are actually exclusive to the PS5, meaning you can't play them anywhere else. Those would be Astro's Playroom and Demon's Souls. Godfall is a PS5 console exclusive, but it's available on PC. Now, the 5 games that I have been playing, which is what I'm basing this review so far on, is NBA 2K21, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Godfall, Spider-Man Miles Morales, and Bugsnax. I am terrible at Souls games, so I didn't actually pick up Demon's Souls, but the general consensus seems to be that it's the most graphically impressive title across both next-gen consoles. Don't worry, there's still plenty of eye candy to be had, particularly with Spider-Man, Assassin's Creed, and Godfall. Of those 5, Miles Morales, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and Godfall are the games that feel the closest to next gen to me. Visually, coming from a PS4 Pro and PC, they're nice, but not the insanely breathtaking experience that I do believe eventually will be delivered, but it's still higher fidelity than the previous generation. It just happens to be a bit more subtle this time around. It's the combination of high quality with the 60 FPS that makes it feel higher end, but when I'm in the middle of gameplay, I don't really notice the finer details. That is, until you go back to the PS4. It's an incremental experience visually that you can only really tell when you go backwards directly after playing on the PS5, and that's when it starts hitting that we're really playing on a powerful machine. As for gameplay, this is where the gap really starts to grow. No, it's not the near zero load times we were promised, but that's mostly due to games needing to be built compatible with older generations, so that will remain true probably for the next year or 2 of releases as gamers transition until we can, fingers crossed, get to that near zero load. But the load times are a massive improvement over last gen, and in particular, 2K21 and Miles Morales is where I felt the game design difference. Granted, I haven't played a 2K game in a few years, but one of my single biggest complaints was the ridiculous load times just to play a game. Trying to play My Career even 2 years ago was a horrible experience during the rookie season, sitting through tens of minutes of load screens, pre-game talk, post-game talk, halftime talk, just to play literally 2 to 5 minutes of actual on-court gameplay. Like, seriously, that would be a 30-minute time commitment just to get through one of those games. Now, you can put in multiple matches in that same time frame. The load speeds are that much better. And for Miles Morales, the seamless transitions of zipping through an air vent from inside a building during a mission back to the city is crazy fast. Yeah, they're quite slick sometimes having you go through a maze-like enclosed section of an air vent, but the transition is more like single-digit seconds compared to half a minute or more on the PS4. It's a quality of life improvement that means you spend more time actually playing instead of doing nothing during your gaming session. You combine these things with the PS5 controller, and you're cooking up an actual brand new gaming experience that is going to be worth your money in a year. Look, I'm not saying that I regret my purchase. I'm having a great time with it. I'm loving it. From a purely objective standpoint, and with the exception of, and this is a pretty big exception, of Cyberpunk.
I know I referenced Cyberpunk bugs a couple of times in this video, but this was all actually scripted and recorded prior to the PlayStation news, so something to keep in mind about bugs in the future.
Most of these titles are still delivering an enjoyable experience on your PS4 or Xbox One. Like I said earlier in the video, games and game selection are the single most important factor to me. And while sure, the last gen consoles are starting to show their age, the difference in experience from that to the PS5 today, right now, coupled with a pretty light launch library and release schedule headed well into 2021, you really aren't missing out on much just yet. It's kind of the same story every launch cycle. Most gamers are still on previous generation, there's high demand, low supply, so games are being built to accommodate where the most gamers are, and that's on last gen. A year from now, once we have launches like Horizon Forbidden West, Deathloop, Final Fantasy XVI, God of War 2, of course all of these have unconfirmed release dates, that is when you will truly start to notice a difference and the library will reflect that you are getting the most out of your console. It's the promise of those games coupled with the proven track record of the PlayStation Studios that led me to buy the PS5. If you manage to get your hands on one, the hype is very real. But if you can't, don't get discouraged. I think that's my point. You're not really missing out on that much right now. And for the love of God, please stop paying $1,000 to scalpers for a PS5. It's definitely not worth that money. So that's my review of the PlayStation 5. As a PC gamer myself, and if you're a PC gamer watching this, it's a no-brainer. Get the PlayStation 5. You can get the Microsoft exclusives on PC. Besides, I think Microsoft is hedging their bets on Game Pass anyways, but that's a whole different conversation. As always, thank you so much for watching. We have another couple of videos lined up through the end of the year, talking about some of our favorite albums, some of our favorite tech, and of course, some of our top games of the year. So stay tuned to that. Make sure you're subscribed to our podcast, and follow us on social. All links are going to be down in the description as always, and I'll catch you next time.